Okay. All right. Good morning. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This is the OpenEmbedded BOF. It was proposed by Nicholas and Khem, and I was asked to sort of chair it, so I'll be the one sort of running the show. The idea for this BOF basically came about because we've noticed, of course, that there are a lot of people using OpenEmbedded within Linaro, but we don't seem to be very well coordinated. In fact, when I was putting together sort of the slides for this, one of my first tasks was to figure out who within Linaro uses OpenEmbedded and for what. And I've been with Linaro now for about 14 months. And I knew of some groups, but I learned of quite a few. I didn't know LNG was using it, for example. That was a big surprise to me. Apparently they use it in a big way. So the first thing is to try and get all the OE people together within Linaro so that, if there's issues and problems, then we can talk about it and figure things out and have a more coordinated front. And also to help have a more communal sort of, get everyone together and have a more unified front. And to help our downstream. Our downstream, obviously, our club members and core members and all that, they're very important to us. And so being able to help them as quickly as possible is obviously top priority. So anyway, to get started, I thought we could, just as by way of quick introduction, Khem here, immediately on my right. He is currently with Comcast. He's principal Linux architect there. He started working with OpenEmbedded around 2005, 2006. He does a lot of the work on the tool chains, for example. He's a current TSC member for OE, and I had wanted to put sort of all the layers that he maintains, as well as Koen. But after I had about 20 of them, I said, no, I think I'll just say maintainer of dozens of OE layers. So, not to belittle their work, but there's lots of layers out there. And certainly one of the lead developers for Angstrom, which is arguably one of the most successful distributions that's put together by OE. And then next, Koen on his right. He's a release manager here at Linaro, and he started working with OE around 2004 to get it working on PDA. OE came out of a system to get Linux working on PDAs. So if you've worked with OE getting it on a PDA, that means you've been there for a while. And he also is a TSC member, and again is probably the principal guy behind. Would that be safe to say? Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely. And again, dozens of layers. It would be hard to find a layer that doesn't have Koen as a maintainer on it. And then myself, I started working with. I'm part of the LHG, I'm with Linaro, I'm part of the home group, and I started working with OE in around 2009 when I purchased a Gumsticks board. And ironically, I've been doing embedded file systems and embedded development for quite a while, and when I first came upon OE, thanks to the Gumsticks board, I thought, no, this can't be right, this is huge, this is terrible. I actually was a bit of a person who was against OE, in fact, in many ways initially. But I realized that all the little problems I was finding with other build systems were all kind of solved, or at least had the framework to be able to easily insert the solution into OE. So sometimes when you dislike something, or when you spend a lot of time trying to find reasons not to use something, you then become more of a convert and more, someone who really enjoys that sort of thing a lot more. You tend to be one of the people that's telling everyone to use OE now. So that's kind of my experience with it. So from the mailings, I sent out a bunch of mailings a couple days ago to all the tech leads and whatnot, some of the managers. And this is the list of OE activities within Linaro. Riku, is he here? No, okay. So Riku does a lot of board bring up and does a lot of work on the V8 porting, and he uses it for almost all his work. It's easy to get one package, say ported to V8, but if you want to actually test it running, you need a file system, and so instead of trying to put together a file system, he has an OE build and he puts it all together and then he tests his package against that. So not only is he just doing builds, because to say it builds is one thing, but to actually make sure it runs is an important step. So he uses OE for his work. In the home group, although Nicholas isn't with the home group anymore, I wanted to put a star beside his name because he was the one who essentially put together the first RDK layer for the home group. The home group, the RDK is something that comes out of Comcast. It's their distribution essentially for set-top boxes. And last year they had us do a bunch of work for them. And one of the main tenets of the work that we did with them was to get their builds up, to prove to them that OE could work within their environment for the massive builds that they were doing. They're supporting half a dozen different architectures, and within those architectures, dozens of boards. And of course, they have their developers, they have their testing, they have their platform team. It's just a monstrous, multifaceted build. And they wanted to know if it worked, so they basically brought us in. Nicholas got it going with that, and we demonstrated it working on 3 different boards. And then within the LNG, again, that was the surprise to me. I had no idea that LNG was using it. They're using it in a big way. I think they're one of the biggest users within Linaro. So it's a little funny that I hadn't heard about them. Mike Holmes, Anders, and Gary Robertson. They use OE because there aren't a lot of people doing big endian file systems, and they need to be testing with big endian. And they need to prove that the networking stuff, if it doesn't work, or if it does work on ARM, they need another architecture to prove that it works or doesn't work on that one as well. So not only are they doing ARM v7 builds, they're doing ARM v8 builds and x86 builds of the exact same image, so that they can compare and contrast them with each other. And then, of course, the toolchain and validation group with Koen and Fatih. They do also big endian, small endian recipes, thousands of them every day. The ARM landing team uses it for their ALIP releases and for OpenJDK. And the Lava team, Tyler Baker specifically, uses it for like core image minimal, just to make sure that all the boards can basically boot to a prompt. He's using OE images for basically all the boards that he can in Lava. So, now that we've gone through who uses it, the main purpose for this talk was to basically try and figure out, because this is a BOF meeting and not, I'm not going to stand here and preach to you for the whole time. The point of the BOF is to discuss. The main questions are there people with any issues within Linaro? Are there any Linaro people here who are using OE and have things, a workflow that OE doesn't quite fit into, something that they would like to see OE do that it doesn't do? Are our downstream customers happy? Are there any things that we can do to help our downstream for anyone using Meta Linaro, for example? Are there better ways that Linaro can help the OE community? There's certainly a lot of work that needs to be done in OE. Pretty much everyone has a wish list of things they would love to see done and that sort of stuff. Should Linaro get more involved? Now that Linaro, of course, is a member of the Linux Foundation, and the Yocto Project is a component, is one of the projects within the within the Linux Foundation. Maybe we should be taking on a bigger role, and maybe we should be becoming a member of the Yocto Project. Those are things that maybe we should discuss. Yeah, how can we make Linaro make OE better? So, any questions? Now, oh yes, go ahead. Oh, hold on.
So you actually missed one user, and that's the enterprise group. And we use OE a lot because until like a few weeks ago, there was no distros for ARMv8.
Right. And big endian, little endian?
No, just, well, because we need to boot to test, so I work for the ACPI teams, because we need to boot kernels and we need like a minimal user space to actually exercise things and get the ACPI CA tools and things. So we've been using OE since like I started a year and a half ago. And also with the announcement of the UEFI test suite, obviously that's OE as well. So we might have to rename it to Open Enterprise.
Yeah, like, again, there's no communication within Linaro, saying who's using it and for what. And
well, I tend to disagree on that. There's no communication at your level because you don't care about the build. You work on your specific scope. Our team, the platform team, is supposed to do the integration for work. So we know exactly who is doing what on the OE side. So if you want a list, that's what we have done. We give you a list of the team using that. I haven't mentioned Leg specifically because it's part of the ARMv8 work that has been started by Riku. On other topics, the issues that we have with OE is lack of maintainers. So we are very agile. We track master. It breaks. It takes 2 weeks to get patches pushed in, and we have to overlay and have an integration layer just to pull the patches because it takes too much time until it's in OE. That's one of the issues that we have.
so the maintainer of like the Meta Linaro layer, is that true? Or other layers?
Yeah, maintainer is a bit different, but OE core is one of the bottlenecks here.
So yeah, one of the problems we are seeing is that getting patches upstream to OE core or Meta OE takes a while. For OE core, we have the wrong email address. If we had an intel.com address, we would get in within 3 days. And getting into Meta OE takes longer because Martin runs a CI loop, and his CI loop takes 13 days to run to test all the permutations. So
it's like having a window. Like he only opens his window at the end of his tests. Yes.
So and that's why we have the integration layer where we can temporarily stash changes to upstream, and it works quite nicely. So if you want to use Linaro without all our tweaks, you just don't use the integration layer. So in theory, we have a nice clean separation of all the layers. So people who want to use a toolchain, use Linaro toolchain, and they will only get a toolchain instead of all the craft we patch.
So you're not saying branches within the layer. You're saying different directories within the layer.
The Linaro is a Git repository with multiple layers, and Linaro, the Git repository, has a Linaro the layer. So it's a bit confusing, but we have multiple Linaro layers, and you can pick which you want to do.
Maybe you should rename it to Linaro Khem or something.
Yeah.
But it was modeled after Meta Intel, right? Wasn't it? Where they, And I think that model is kind of dying, to be honest. I don't think too many are doing that anymore.
Yeah. So essentially, I think you mentioned so much of, my observation is that there is so much of work that you're putting into in different groups. Wouldn't it be better if you had like, your own, per se, distro, that everyone in Linaro shares, and then you could maintain your own upstream kind of like mirrors, if you will, of all the layers that you're interested in and you're contributing to. That would be a really good value proposition for downstreams like Comcast and other people who are consuming, eventually the output. And now speaking of the patch flow, I think more participation and more responsibility share is essentially what's needed. In order to get your patches, so OE core has its own CI loop to a certain extent, and it's a very rigorous one. So what happens is, why I say rigorous one is because it's rigorous for the patches that come from people who are not working on Yocto, and because Yocto people share the same auto builder infrastructure that comes from the Yocto project. So there is a history behind those patches, and they get proposed to OE core, and they have been already vetted against so-called known auto builder system. So if you step up your auto builder system, expose it that's how we are testing all our patches, these are kind of stuff we do, then I'm pretty sure that this will expedite if you feel any of those that there is a lag in acceptance of patches. And I think, yeah, I mean the kind of the resource constraintness that they have when they have patches that they pick from mailing lists, it goes through that cycle again, and sometimes that is a delay, that causes a delay. And the second thing is the time-based release model also. So scheduling your patches based upon the release would also expedite some of the patch acceptance. Although it's kind of building up, it's not like kernel as of now that there is an open window and patches get accepted. But planning according to that would also help you, scheduling your patch submissions and get them accepted in a relatively quick fashion. But this is also a feedback that I'll take back, and we'll make sure that if there is something that can be leveraged from OE in terms of CI, or if there is a sub-component maintainer model that can be pushed through. But again, I think that can come from Linaro as well. There can be a pull request sent from Linaro. That's why I was talking about consolidation, where you have patches from LNG, LHG, and others. Put them all together and then have your one interface going into a core. That has a lot of advantages in terms of scheduling your submissions, and it has it can become more of a component maintainer responsibility as we go forward. So that would be my suggestion.
I would like that very much to have a kind of a Linaro funnel for pull requests, because sometimes we see patches going to an upstream OE like Meta OE and OE core, and go like, oh, please don't submit something like that upstream. And then I don't want to go on a public mailing list saying this is all bad. Yes. Here's why it is, and then you have to hunt them down internally.
One Linaro employee to another on a public mailing list. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, but
some of them they do it, but it's up to you. I mean, I don't mind that, but I agree. Like if it is if it is done in a consolidated fashion, I think it's much more value. And right now the model that OE core has is there is one maintainer and doesn't scale up. So essentially, if there is more work done on a consolidated pull request, then that, and then the confidence builds up, then I think things will get easier.
Yeah, that's another issue that we have, the batch workflow. So it's really mapped on the kernel workflow. You submit a patch on the mailing list, and the problem with that is you never know when it's there, it's in. So what in my workflow, from time to time, I just have to dig directly in next, master next, to see if my patch has been pulled and stuff like that. There's no feedback. So sometimes you don't have feedback because nobody is reviewing the patch, which is a problem. And you don't have a reply because it's okay, it's already in. So this is another problem, and I think the workflow can be improved on the side.
Yeah.
Yes, I think certainly that's a very good feedback. I think it's going through that growing thing now, right now, that there has to be certain known methods. So essentially there was Saul who was doing the pull requests, and now I think that's one method that was in there. But I agree that more information that can be passed on to the developer, what's happening with their patches, that either via some tools or via some auto mailer or what have you, some sort of things. Certainly.
Maybe even a GitHub, just like emails like, your patch went in.
On the kernel mailing list, sometimes when your series is accepted, you receive the notification. There's Gerrit as well. but there's something to do here.
Is there a commit list?
There is a commit list, yes. There is a mailing list that all the commits go to. It's a less known mailing list.
It's not known, you mean.
OE commits. Yeah, OE commits has all the information that goes in.
But that's almost like LKML. It's too high volume to start filtering out. It's just easier to do git pull minus rebase and then seeing, hey, a patch disappeared.
Yeah.
And that's basically the only way. Sometimes after 3 months, suddenly your patch goes in and there have been 0 replies or comments on it. And then you ask, like, why did it take so long? And like, yeah, time constraints or whatever. There's almost no communication, and because people are overloaded. So the best thing to happen for OE core would be to do sub-maintainers and pull requests, so you know that I submitted the patch to a maintainer and he has it in his pull request. And if it doesn't go in, we can trace why instead of we have one person committing patches to OE core. And it would be nice that if we go to the maintainer and sub-maintainer model, if Linaro could say, like, we're going to pay you to maintain this bit of OE core or whatever. And be on record for that, because we in Linaro we don't really maintain, but if it breaks we have to fix it because it's in our regular builds.
Exactly.
We don't publicize that. So
yeah, so that's kind of my suggestion here is that turn that role up and then own up to the pieces, and then people will look up to you. Maintainers will then that relation will help, because if you look at from OE core perspective, right now there is one maintainer, right, and everybody touches every piece of it, and depending upon if it is affecting you. So, so I think that's where I think Linaro is well positioned, and they can, help as well as get help in return by owning up as a sub-maintainer. And you could start with certain pieces, maybe ARM architecture maintainer, right? It's essentially not only consolidate your requests to begin with, but also any other request comes on the mailing lists that are ARM based. So basically upstream can rely on that, okay, patch is on the mailing list, but it's pulled through the Linaro pull request. So that kind of responsibility share has to be owned by Linaro in order for that to facilitate. A bigger example is right now there is a pull request going for ARM v8 on the mailing list right now. I didn't see any.
Hilariously bad and buggy, and
right.
And they didn't talk to us, so that's.
So this is kind of disconnect that that bothers me. So I've been trying to ask them, go through Linaro, Riku or others who have done this work. So I would expect Riku to reply to this mail saying that this patch is good or not, and this could be done this way or not. So that kind of like participation would really facilitate a lot of it. And as I see, I think it's a very valuable thing for you in general also to submit your changes upstream, and that'll help.
Unfortunately, there is an ugly side to that as well. So if you require all Linaro employees to actually get their patches vetted before setting upstream, that will delay the as well. So I don't know if you decide to have an internal mailing list or something with Linaro to review the patches first before submitting them upstream. So just
it depends. So it would be nice to have an internal mailing list, but we have Garrett and some groups submit patches. And I have, 8 or 9 outstanding patches from June. It said, like, this needs to get changed, and then nothing. But still complaining that it takes months to get patches in. So it's, having the funnel would be so great, because then you could really see we're not the bottleneck. Like, Fadi and I are bottlenecks for a lot of things, because we're ridiculously understaffed for some things. But for other things, no, we really aren't the bottleneck.
Yeah, I want to enforce to have this consolidation or peer review. I mean, some people are just, what they're doing, and I want to try to enforce that. However, some people, we are kind of beginner, they never touch OE, but they need to get the works done. So in that case, it makes sense to have peer review.
Yeah. And you have the difference between drive-by patching, like someone in LNG says, oh, this broke and I fixed it, it's not really important, and he sends a patch. Well, it doesn't really need to get funneled through it, but if they say, well, we have this big product that we need to work, and this work is part of them, like a proper review flow within Linaro would be a good thing.
If nothing else, hopefully this presentation has introduced Linaro employees to other OE Linaro employees. So if you're new at this and a little concerned about getting of course we don't have that funnel system in now, but at least you have some names now that you could run your patch past before sending it through if you're a little nervous about the first couple. Do you have any proposals, like a mailing list, or, oh, and by the way, sorry, Dennis, you're a TSC member as well, aren't you?
No, I'm Board of Directors.
Board of Directors, yes. This is Dennis Dmitrienko from TI, and has been using OE for a long time. You're a maintainer of the Meta TI layer, among other stuff. So. Proposals or comments?
Well, I would start with an OE or Meta Linaro layer mailing list, so that we can catch external contribution as well. For example, Dennis and Khem go like, we have this patches for Meta Linaro, where do we send them to? Like, oh, you can put it in Garrett, and then like, oh, Garrett is closed.
Yeah.
So that's being worked on. That's
like Meta TI or Meta Arrival and all that sort of stuff.
We're working on that.
We're working on that external people can
Yes.
put patches in Garrett.
Yes.
Well, they can now get sent to Linaro Dev, and I check that email list like once a week or so.
Oh, okay.
So that's, patches get lost and we need to do that better. And if we're going to have a mailing list for that, we can just make that the Linaro OE mailing list and use that.
Public. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
I don't want to do rigid enforced rules. It's like get a mailing list and see what works.
Yeah.
Either way you do it, mailing list or any other ways, as long as it's being upstreamed and consolidated in the Linaro layer is good. The worst case scenario that we've faced internally is that people starting using stuff that's been upstream and fork it and never contribute back. So that's we don't want to see that. So like you said, within Linaro you have multiple teams using it, so we would like to see those contributions back, not just hidden in some private layer.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point for you got it. Okay.
Cool. I don't know if I missed this, but is there work on multi-lib to support 32-bit libraries and 64-bit libraries in our minimal InitRAM-FS, any of our builds, basically?
No, and there are a lot of problems with trying to do that. One of it is the ARMv8 ABI is a mess, the ARMv7 ABI is a mess, and we need to have someone write down the use case and explain why he wants to have it, and when he doesn't get it, what happens, because I think it's nonsense to have that. It's just a checkbox item. It's not useful, especially with the 64K pages problem where you have to recompile all your ARMv7 apps just to run because you can't load them at 8,000 anymore. So there are a lot of technological problems involved with multi-lib or multi-arch doing it like that, and so I would prefer not to look at it unless someone really wants it and hands over $1 million to us to implement it, because it's a train wreck. So the question is no, we're not looking at that yet.
Yeah, I think the valid case would be if you have pre-compiled binaries. So if you, and then there is a soft float, hard float quandary as well. So I don't know, like, you need a lot of stuff in there if you have to if you want to go multi-lib, then you want to go all the way. You just don't want to stop at certain point.
Well,
right?
I'm just looking for something equivalent of IA32 libs library in Ubuntu, right?
Yeah, IA32, I mean, ARM is a little bit different in that sense, right? Because the ABI changed several times, right? So, so what do you define in multi-lib, multi-arch? Is it ARM v7 and ARM v8, or is it ARM v7, ARM v5, ARM v4, or is it eABI, non-eABI? You know, so there are several.
Okay, I understand the complexity now.
So,
Thanks, yeah.
so your use case is one of these, right? But if you look at from the whole ecosystem point of view, so either you have it or you don't have it. So that's why $1 million.
Yes.
But I'm not sure that it's so hard actually. So in fact, actually, the guys downstream, so let's say actually Monteist and all this in the CG7, which is OpenEmbedded base, they do create actually multi-lib 64-bit V7. And frankly, we actually kind of, like my parent company, actually Cisco, actually absolutely we have actually kind of that case. We have V8 kernel, we have actually some 64-bit actual processes running, and then we have actually kind of code that we haven't converted to be 64-bit compliant, and then we will create kind of 32-bit actual runtime. Currently, actually, kind of like 2 ships in the night, but effectively it would be nice to see that inside. And as with respect of ABIs, I think it's you're kind of creating it more complicated than it is. So within actually V8 to V7, you just kind of pick up actually your options and you kind of sort of fix them. But coexistence actually V8 and V7 in terms of naming the libraries and all this stuff, it is like simple and bigger fish for us.
Yeah, so the only use case that I see is, or only where it is valid is when you can't recompile your binary, right? That's the only use case that is valid for multi-lib. Otherwise, if you are compiling a binary just because it doesn't work on 64-bit.
Maybe I'm missing something. You just create actually one rootfs where you can run actually both 64-bit and 32-bit actually kind of V7, where you can run actually kind of like old kind of like compile. It doesn't matter whether actually binaries or actually just compile. I may actually have code that I cannot move to 64-bit yet, right? Or actually maybe actually by performance reason I choose to be actually kind of still 32-bit. Another half of the system actually kind of like running into 64-bit.
Yeah, essentially, I think the second case I will say is kind of the first case is why it was created for Intel, right? Where people had DOS16 binaries or whatnot, like sources were lost. You can't recompile those, right? So that's why the motivation behind this was. I don't think porting was any way that they wanted a way to have the application compile 32-bit because they were porting it over. But I mean, I'm not for it or against it. It's just that it's not there, and it's a little bit of complexity from tooling aspect as well. But it can be done. The Intel was easier. Here you have to draw a line at certain point saying that, okay, hard flow ARM v7 32-bit, that's it. Or, so you have to draw a line sometime, maybe that will be easier. But when you say multi-lib, people will just get in their mind saying, okay, it's like Intel, right? So they'll bring their old ARM v5 binaries, want to run over here, and all those things. So you have to provide the simulations and stuff like that in all the soft float libraries, and like they do exist. It's how you put it together, right? You got a modify system, use the proper linkers, for example, right? They have dynamic linker encoded in the binaries, so that naming, those are little things, but they are very problematic. And if you want it, think it through, have it. I mean, it's not an issue, but it's just, again, as Koen was saying.
It's the details. We could do 32-bit, 64-bit multi-lib, and it would work for one use case, but then people go like, hey, you have multi-lib, I want to use it as well, and then
it's a big use case after one after another. So people.
And not every ARM v8 chip has a 32-bit implementation. So RLP32 is something different, but yeah.
Yeah, so actually we have a request about that in the queue pending.
RLP32.
So we need to know this one, multi-arch on OpenEmbedded. So we need to investigate. So we have a concrete case where a member, we need to understand what's the requirement, what's his use case, if it does make sense, and how much effort to get that done.
Yes, because
So here you're talking just about ARC32 versus ARC64 in your case?
Yeah, R64, ARM32.
It's not a node, it's API, right?
So from what I'm hearing, there is discussion about ARC64, ARC32, but there's not a whole lot of, that's at least in the scope of things that we're thinking about, not like ARM-v8 versus ARM-v7, ARM-v5e, and 16.
The ARM v7 is not one thing.
Yeah,
There are at least 5 different ABIs out there that don't work together well. So,
Understood.
I have a totally different subject here. Relatively new to OpenEmbedded. I was recently tasked with getting some of the LTP real-time test suite functioning properly so that we could test our LNG kernels, and ran into some problems with autoconf. The first thing I noticed is that there's a glaring hole in the reference materials available online in terms of the way autoconf and bitbake work together. Having been only dimly aware of the way autoconf functions, and even more dimly aware of the functionality of bitbake, I was pretty much at a loss. And the very thing that makes bitbake and OpenEmbedded so versatile is that it changes its behavior on the fly. So static walkthroughs are extremely difficult to figure out what's going to happen at runtime when you're dealing with multiple layers of macro systems and that sort of thing. So that's the introduction. The question is there any kind of a schedule as to when the autoconf section of the Yocto and OE reference manuals might be fleshed out so that...
That's a very good input, I guess. Not many people would provide that. I would say that there are bugs that can open against documentation. So I think Yocto Project has dedicated people for documenting stuff, and this is a common piece of documentation that's across Yocto, whatever. So I would just open a bug in the Yocto Project Bugzilla and ask for improvement.
But keep in mind that solving auto tools problems is more like fixing upstream software. So there's a big chance that it will say this is out of scope because the documentation is about using OpenEmbedded, not about fixing upstream software.
Yeah, so essentially that's true. Like if you are dealing with autoconf, right, then of course you have to do the way autoconf does it. It's out of scope for Yocto, but a section explaining how autoconf is driven by bitbake, right?
Yes.
For example, we build out of source, right? We regenerate configure. We don't respect the pre-generated configure files. All those kind of details. They need to be documented, and probably the process, how all this happens, like all the M4 macros. We basically use a version of autoconf, and then we use consistent macros, because if you take every package, something is 2.69, using 2.69 autoconf, someone is 264. So there are a lot of differences that way. What Kooi does is brings them on to the same version of autoconf, right? So those are kind of details we can document. Yes. But if you run into a macro issue, right, something is not working, then of course that's autoconf documentation and upstream auto tools, mailing list, or anywhere you want to.
But to illustrate the point, when Linaro started the ARM-v8 port, I was still at TI, I think. Martin started sending patches against upstream software that he would put in a metadata that would fix add ARC64, etc. to config.guess. And then he had 20 or so patches. Then I said, you don't actually need to patch it. You just need to make sure that you run new config eyes, because every piece of software he patched had a custom do configure in the recipe because the auto tool stuff was outdated and broken. And then we said like, oh, I don't need to patch it, I just need to regenerate config.gas. And if we would have had a documentation, that would have saved him a lot of time, but it's a bit hard.
In my case, I thrashed around for quite a while trying to guess where AutoConf was failing. And in the end, a gentleman from IBM actually evidently was more conversant with it than I am, furnished a patch, which it turned out that AutoConf was not recursing deeply enough into the directory hierarchy to find all the stuff it was supposed to be looking, all the macros it was supposed to be looking for. And but along the way, one of the things that I thought might have been wrong was that, and here again, this is yet another subject, but the LNG group seems to have a talent for pushing the envelope of all the tools that we use, and we are using a separate set of tools developed at Linaro to create at least our ARM kernel images. We actually use OE to do our x86 kernel images, I believe, but we create a root file system image which does not have a kernel. We're using the Linux dummy kernel as a placeholder there. But my first inclination was that perhaps we didn't have the appropriate set of kernel headers to indicate what features our kernels eventually would be supporting after we overlay those on top of our root file system image. And so I was trying to find a way that we could take one of our kernels and do something similar to the Linux dummy so that we did not wind up with the actual kernel image in the final deployed root file system image. But along the way, we built the kernel to a sufficient extent that we could include the kernel headers for AutoConf to, if it was checking for kernel features. So that AutoConf had the proper set of kernel headers in the staging area, I guess it would be. And that's where I ran into the problem with the documentation, because it wasn't exactly clear to me at what stages BitBake was going to place headers into a directory where the rest of the application packages and library packages could use AutoTools to configure against the kernel headers. So
yeah, it's a pretty early process. So it's even done before tool chains are built. So
well, it's the linlib headers. We need the actual kernel headers for that. So the short answer to that is, if your application needs the actual kernel headers, don't use Linux dummy.
Right.
Application, so it's not you're wanting raw headers.
Raw headers.
Okay.
But I actually had emailed Trevor to ask him how would we go about taking one of our kernels, including it in the build, but not including it in the final root file system image that we deploy. And that was an unusual enough request that he wasn't sure exactly how we would go about that.
Yeah, essentially what you're then doing is a module kind of thing, right?
Yes.
And, so you will need a kernel for yourself, and you can. It's easy because kernel is packaged outside. It's the kernel modules that go into your root file system, right?
It's something like perf that needs intimate knowledge of the kernel, but it's not a kernel module. We need to build things like that, like weird tools that are the problem. They need the actual kernel headers, not the Linux libc headers.
That I got it. So they need the raw kernel headers, yes. And that's fine. What you want is to build those modules common and then have different kernels underneath and expect it to work?
I think that the problem is that in Linaro we still use hardware packs, so we have the root file system and then we have kernel bits and we smash them together.
That's wrong.
So we want to have, yeah, I know. We want to have a root file system with no kernel stuff in it. But at the same time we want to build the apps that depend on the kernel, but still have a clean root file system. So in essence, we might probably need to do something in our image recipe, just delete all the kernel stuff if it's ends up. That's the 5-minute solution.
Yeah.
There was work item to introduce actually machine specific, basically introduce more object kernel like than just generic machines. And when you introduce, let's say, if you introduce Arundel board, right? So you have to build against Arundel kernel, and then actually everything that depends actually on the kernel will pick it up. I thought actually somebody was committing that, no? So basically, currently we're still staying actually with just generic actually machine types. We don't have actually CPU specific types. Board specific.
I mean, one of the use cases that I can think of is like, you know, as more members at least, or whoever starts using the 3.14 LSK, right? You would want to have 3.14 kernel headers, and then have like different kernels. Whoever wants to use those will. You don't have to include the Z image, but you could include the 3.14 header, for example, right?
Yeah, but the problem is that those headers depend on your kernel configuration. That's why they're not Linux libc headers. So shipping those headers might create more problems than it solves.
Yeah.
Anyway,
my final solution for those will be go kernel per machine, right? Don't try to mix and match.
I agree. Yeah.
Anyway,
Don't try to mix and match.
2 to noon. Sorry to disrupt, but thank you everyone for coming. That's certainly